So I called Dean and I said, well, no, and I was with Dean. I told him about it. He said, what was her name? I said, Joan Cooney. He said, what'd she look like? So I told him. He said, how old was she? I told him. He said, does the name Gans mean anything to you? He said, yeah. I said, her name was Joan Gans Cooney. Cooney must be her married name. Her maiden name probably was Gans. He said, you won't believe this. I said, what? He said, I asked her to marry me when we went to the University of Arizona together. Where is she? So I told him. He calls her. He says, how can I help you? And she tells him that she's got foundation funding, but she wants to take this national. And she applied to HEW, now HHS, and they turned her down. The secretary was Casper Weinberger. So Dean says, well, you come down here. I'll take you to see Goldwater. Goldwater has got Weinberger's budget. So he took her to Goldwater's office. And Goldwater looked at her and he said, Joan Gans Cooney. He said, are you from Arizona? She said, yes. He said, are you from Phoenix? She said, yes. She said, are you related to Harry Gans? She said, that's my uncle. And Goldwater gets up and gives her a big hug and says, Harry Gans was my first contributor when I first ran for office. What can I do for you? So she tells him the story. He said, I'll get Weinberger on the phone. So he gets Weinberger on the phone. Weinberger gives her the $1 million. And that Barry Goldwater was responsible for Sesame Street getting out.
Why don't we end right here? This is Gary Johnson, and the 16th of June, and we're on the third tape in our interview with Newton Minow. What do you think about the future of broadcasting?
I think outside of the atomic bomb, the development of broadcasting is probably one of the most important inventions of our time. The fact that we can see what's going on all over the world simultaneously is critical. I was very proud to have had a hand in the development of the communication satellites. And I went on a trip with President Kennedy to visit the space stations. And he called me over and he said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm dealing with the communications satellites. I said, it's more important, Mr. President, than sending a man into space. And he said, why do you say that? I said, communication satellites send ideas into space. Ideas last longer than people. And I said, this is going to be very important. I had no conception of how important. I was only thinking at that time it would be within the United States. I had no conception that this would mean we could watch what's going on in Iran or in China or any place. And so I think it's of critical importance. I think public television has been not properly funded in our country, but I think it's growing in importance. I think with the advent now of the newest technology, of digital technology, and computers and iPods and Kindles and iPhones, nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. But I think that broadcasting will still have a very major impact.
Why don't we take public television and just run right through from your first involvement with it, all the way through your role here in Chicago as the chairman of WTTW. Just a whole longitudinal question about public broadcasting.
Chicago was exceptional in the history of public television. Edward L. Ryerson, who was Mr. Chicago in his time, he was the chairman of Inland Steel, University of Chicago, the Symphony Orchestra, Republican Party. There was no cause in Chicago in which he didn't play a major role. He had a friend in Boston named Ralph Lowell, who was very involved with educational, now called public radio. One day in the 50s, Ralph Lowell called Mr. Ryerson and he said, there's a new thing called educational television. And he said, Chicago should apply for a channel and you can get it for nothing from the government. And then you can build an educational station to be good for Chicago. Mr. Ryerson did that. Unfortunately, Mr. Lowell apparently didn't know anybody in New York or Los Angeles or Washington or Cleveland or Detroit or Philadelphia, because nobody got a phone call there, and there was no educational television in Chicago. But there was one in Boston, where Mr. Lowell lived, and one in Chicago. So when President Kennedy and I arrived in Washington, we were shocked to find that most cities didn't have a station. None in Washington, none in New York, none in Los Angeles. So I set aside to change that. In order to do that, we had a big fight in New York, but we managed to do it with a VHF station. That's channels number 1 through 13. The others we had to go with UHF, which were channels above that. And we had to get Congress to change the law to require that television manufacturers would put a UHF tuner in every television set.
So that was in part driven by the need to open up TV stations to public.
That was, to me, that was the biggest part of it.
That was interesting.
Some of the commercial broadcasters also were supporting it. Right. People at Zenith here in Chicago were very supportive of it. They had the same thing with FM, with AM radio. So we got that through Congress on a bipartisan basis. And that led to what we now call the public television. We now have, I don't remember exactly, but it's more than 200 stations in the United States. Eventually, we connected them through satellites. And I served on the board of what became their connected unit called PBS, and later became chairman of it. And we still suffer from inadequate funding. We've always got our hat out, just as the Chicago History Museum does for donors, but it became very important. Other countries started with public television and then added commercial television. We did it the other way around. I think the promise of public television is demonstrated by things like Sesame Street, like the Lehrer News Hour, like Frontline, like great performances from New York. And I'm hoping that it's better days. The same thing was true of public radio. We opened that up with FM, really. So those are the things I'm proud of.
Now, each of those shows that you mentioned, no longer is there a public broadcasting monopoly. There's Nickelodeon with children's shows. The British imports come on our A&E. Has this changed the business plan for public broadcasting, the competition?
It's made it much harder. Public television has faced increasing competition where, curiously, the opposite has happened with public radio. News is dying on commercial radio, but it's growing on public radio. On the other hand, on television, a lot of the stuff that public television pioneered is now moving to commercial.
But your belief is that despite the fact that other outlets are carrying some of the same kinds of material, there still is an indispensable role for public TV.
I think so, and I believe, I hope that it will continue for generations to come.
Now, with regard to WTTW in particular, you mentioned that they were one of the very first. What about your chairmanship of WTTW?
I had a one-decision chairmanship. Mr. Ryerson asked me to succeed him. I had a funny experience with him. The first thing I did was to name our new building for him over his protest. And I asked him to come out to have his picture taken. He said, "I don't want any publicity." I said, "No publicity, I want this for the archives." This was at the height of the Vietnam War. And I said, "Mr. Ryerson," I said, "you know I'm a Democrat." He says, "I know. I checked you out." I said, "Well, I want you to know I'm so upset with President Johnson in the Vietnam War, I may vote Republican this time." He put his arm around me. He said, "You don't have to call me Mr. Ryerson. You can call me Ed." So later, when Humphrey became the candidate, I became chairman of the Humphrey campaign. And I saw him and he said, "You can call me Mr. Ryerson." But I loved him. He was a great guy. No, I had a one-decision chairmanship because I hired the man who then led WTTW for the next, I think, 28 years, and that was Bill McCarter. He was running the station in Washington, D.C. I have been very impressed with him. I went to see him. He said, "Why should I leave running the station in the nation's capital to come to Chicago?" And I said, "Bill, Washington may be the capital of the United States, but Chicago's the capital of the world." And he believed me. He believed me. So he came and he did a great, great job.